So Steve, take it away.
So Phil, again, thank you and welcome to this group. We go back 127 Zoom calls, started a while ago, usually Wednesday nights. And we've had a few others for different schedules. I wasn't sure if we should refer to you today as Professor Emeritus, Pastor, Doctor, or Phil, but in our email correspondence, you said Phil is fine, Phil. So that's the way it's going to be.
It's what my students called me, so.
And as we go around the horn here, you know my brother Bruce, and you know the background now. In the top right corner, if this follows right, is my cousin from Madison, Dr. Richard Lindgren. He's the oldest grandson of Frank and Amy Lindgren. And his younger brother is in the right bottom corner. And my brother, who you know about, let's see, if I use the term the Minneapolis Mafia with you, I don't think I have, but I just did. Bruce, Dave, and I think Dave lives in the neighborhood that you live in the St. Croix and Stillwater. Do I have that right?
Yeah, when we're not up here in Hovland, which is our main home, we're in Marina and St. Croix. So just
and then Dick's two daughters are here from Lombard. Amy on the left, and in the center screen is Laura from Ames, Iowa. And Laura, I think, is the only one of this group that attended North Park. We got that right? Amy attended Wheaton in Chicago. Okay, I got that right. And it looks like JJ's coming in from San Francisco here shortly. So we won't put him on the spot, but JJ, are you hearing us?
Hey, I hear you.
Yep. We've just done the introductions and Phil is ready to go with some questions, but it was good timing for you to enter. Phil, this is a person that we got to know through Zoom, lives in San Francisco. He is the grandson of my great uncle, Obed Simon Johnson. Yep. And actually, I'm going to just take a minute here and talk about Obed Simon. That was one of the things I was going to send to you, who's an important part in the history that I've learned about more. My dad was named after Obed Simon. My middle name is Obed, so I probably pay more attention than others do to this, but he was the fifth of six children of our grandparents, Amy and Frank. He was born on May 5th, 1881 in Iowa. And running the risk of bragging, I apologize in advance. He graduated from Carleton College in 1906. Oberlin Theological Seminary in 1909. He actually went to 3 different theological seminaries. Did missionary work in China from 1909 to 1923. Well, I could go on, but one thing we have been trying to track down, and you may know the name of this gentleman, Andrew Miller, and the archivist at North Park tried to help us with this, and others.
Yeah, Andy Meyer. Yep.
Andy Meyer. We think, we haven't been able to confirm this, but we're pretty sure that he delivered the commencement address at North Park College in June of 1935. He taught there later from 44 to 57. Subjects taught were philosophy, ethics, sociology, and the life and letters of Paul. So that's his grandson in the right corner. JJ, did I do justice to that summary of your grandpa?
Yeah, this is great.
Yeah.
Well, we want to talk about 4 questions that Phil has had in advance, and Bruce and Dave and I have talked about. To start this discussion, I'd like to do a little bit of an introduction of Johanna Dorothea, but I'd like some help from Laura on this. You probably know more than all of us combined from your readings, and you had mentioned in a recent email about this little book. And I just learned about this recently, Phil, so my first question to you is going to be, or has been, what might have motivated Johanna Dorothea to trek across Iowa 14 miles across the Des Moines River to hear Carl August Bjork preach? We're guessing sometime around 1868. We could be off on that, but Laura, do you want to give a little background on the book and Psalm 25?
Sure. Yes.
Thanks.
So there is a biography by, my dad's actually can say this better than me probably, but it's Carl Backstrom wrote a biography about the covenant presidents, and there's different volumes, but this one happens to have the 3 covenant presidents. Right. And in it, there's a short paragraph about Mrs. J.P. Johnson, my great-great-grandmother, and she had been reading this book called Herren Erfrun, by P.P. Waldenstrom, and she was in some kind of soul distress, Schwala Nud or something like that. I only took 2 semesters of Swedish at North Park, so I'm sure I'm not saying that correct, but it inspired her to walk across the prairies and ford the Des Moines River somehow to get to the Swede Bend to hear Pastor Bjork speak. And so this summer we were having a family reunion, and I thought, well, I'd like to see if I could find this book, this Herren Erfrun, and I found it. And what amazed me was the subtitle was Reflections on David's 25th Psalm. And so each chapter is that P.P. Waldenstrom wrote was about, I think, just one of the verses. And from what I understood, just looking into some commentaries on this psalm, is that it was in Hebrew, it was like their alphabet. So the first verse was the A of the Hebrew, or the first letter, and so that was kind of interesting. And then into the psalm, it talks about being in soul distress. So I thought, wow, she was just, maybe she was concerned about her sin or something like that, or just maybe there was some kind of just a lot of difficulties in her life, and she just wanted to worship the Lord and hear from the pastor. And I'm sure they were, of course, very isolated out there in the Iowa prairie. And so I would just, and P.P. Waldenstrom is fascinating too. I mean, he was kind of a renegade from what I've read, and yet, he sounds to me, I go to Calvary Chapel, and he sounds to me like a Calvary Chapel pastor where he's emphasizing the love of God and not the wrath of God. And I think that's one of the things that some covenant writers have written about.
Oh yeah. Yeah, at length. What year was she born?
Oh, good.
Or what age would she have been when she's walking,
I do not know that for sure.
Lanyon, Swede Bend.
We have that. We'll have that in a second here.
I might have her gravestone on my phone. I could look at it.
Yeah. Well, it sounds like she was single anyway, either a young woman or.
Well, here's a part to that we've discussed, but not at length, is there was quite a bit of an age difference between JP, her husband, and Johanna. And Bruce, we had just discussed this. Was it as much as 13 years?
Yes, although I don't have in my mind anything very precise on that, but I did. Steve asked me to have this picture available, and so I'll put it up. This is was from 1892, and if I have it right, this is Johanna Dorothea here. And this person is, Dave, help me if I'm making a mistake. I think this is J.P. Johnson here. So I'm just comparing these two. You can see a fairly obvious age difference.
And where was that taken? In Lanyon, or?
We think it was in the Lanyon area, but we've never been able to pin down where. That, this background might be indicative of some things that we can figure out, but
Probably a photographer's studio.
That seems very likely.
Yeah.
Yeah, especially for that time, 1892, they would have used some, well, a film camera, but it would have been a large film camera.
Right.
I have 1846 as her birthday.
Okay, so.
And then her husband, 1834.
Yeah, well, so I mean, she wouldn't have been going to hear Bjork before 1868. So she's 22 years old and probably close to being married. Who knows? But I think the main thing to say about this is that it was not unusual, first of all, at that period of time for people to walk. Local history that I've done in various areas shows that to walk 14 miles to something you really needed to do or wanted to do, people did it. And so you're motivated, first of all, to make a walk like that. And this was a period of revival and renewal. And in the late 1860s, sort of the beginning of tensions with the Augustana Synod, which tried to be the Church of Sweden for all these immigrants. But for those who had been part of renewal experiences prior to immigration, and that's where Waldenstrom comes in, and Karl Olof Fresenius and Karl Johan Nyvall, and all these people who would have been well known to Johanna, or if you experienced it after immigration. I assume she was born in Sweden, but there was a longing and a hungering among many people, and the nature of the times and the preaching and some of the hardship, a typical way to talk about your journey was, to be in distress of some kind, a deep sense of longing that needed to be satisfied. Bjork was just a cobbler, and he came to the Swede Bend area in 1864 as a cobbler. And maybe you've read or know about his own conversion experience in Sweden. It was kind of dramatic. I could tell you about that if you're interested. But when he came in 1864, in Swede Bend was the first place that people began to gather. And out of that, a congregation was formed in 1868 in July. There were 4 congregations that eventually became covenant in 1885, and Swede Bend was the first. And then there was a question about Galesburg. Galesburg was one of the other 2. So Bjork sort of stands out because he was a person gaining a lot of notoriety in the movement. And the story of how he became a preacher, again, which you may know, is that if the pastor or you relied on traveling evangelists were not able to be when the group gathered on Sunday, a lay person would not necessarily preach. They didn't think of it as preaching, but they would fill the speaking time often by reading Pietistan, and that was a religious journal that began in Sweden in the early 1840s and was just as popular here. It might take 6 weeks for the new issue of Pietistan across the Atlantic, but people read it. And that was first edited by Rosenius, who died in 1868, and then Waldenstrom became its longtime editor. So Bjork typically would simply read a sermon or a commentary out of Pietistan. Well, the custodian at their little mission house, which is what they called the church, probably freshly built, thought he'd play a joke on Bjork. And Bjork the night before had put his copy of Pietistan on the shelf underneath the pulpit. And when it came time for him to read out of Pietistan, well, the custodian had removed it. And Bjork said, I had nothing to do. I read the text and then I began to preach. And that's where his vocation as a preacher started. And he became very well known. And in revival movements, whether it was in Sweden or, you know, the Great Awakening in the American colonies in the 18th century, if there was someone you wanted to hear speak, you would walk much more than 14 miles. And you'd hitch up your team of horses and you'd throw your whole family in the buggy and off you went. So I think that Johanna was not alone. She was probably walking with others, or there were others, you know, on the way. And it was in those settings that you would get converted. Also in rural settings, and there's a lot of evidence for this, mission meetings could extend over several days. And so you might, for example, go to Swede Bend and not only hear Bjork preach, but hear other preachers. And lots of food, lots of coffee, lots of children, families, and the people who lived in that area would open their homes in very hospitable ways for these pilgrims who had traveled and might be there for 2, 3, 4 days. And for these young preachers, it became very competitive. And you might hear 5 or 6, and then they'd preach again. And then they joke about Vem tog priset, who won the prize, you know. And so there was a lot of energy around this. And so I think her experience was very typical, but it says a lot of her that she would walk 14 miles and maybe home the same day just to hear someone preach.
Excellent, thank you. Let's see if there are some questions to follow up. I know I have one, but anybody?
Well, I asked my grandma Hazel, my grandfather's, she was not Swedish at all, but I said, how did she go? It's in the biography, it says a pioneer mother. Now they could have been talking about her now. She's a pioneer mother. Maybe she was single then. And so I asked my grandmother, I said, well, how did she do it with the babies? Oh, she just carried her babies in her apron, or she just carried the babies with her. I'm sure she couldn't have done it by herself for 14 miles, as you say. But yeah. So, and I don't know where the story comes from that Pastor Backstrom, it just says there are stories about Mrs. J.P. Johnson. So just of one of the pioneers, and so just such a few sentences. So
well, those stories circulated. This was very much a storytelling tradition, and if someone you know, becomes a little well known in their community or within the Covenant Church or whatever, these stories would accumulate. And Backstrom, you know, had access to this. It'd be interesting to know if these were stories that appeared in the religious newspapers at the time, because they would print those things. They had always columns for women and for children in these publications that came out often weekly. So he had his sources, he just doesn't tell us, and he picked out that one, and that's significant. And probably because it's linked to Bjork. Here's an example of someone who so much wanted to hear him preach that as a young woman, she walked that far.
Yeah, good. My brother
like
John.
Dick, just 1 second. I'm going to introduce Ann here that just came on. This is Mayor John from Des Moines' daughter. But Bruce, are we having technical difficulties?
I don't think we are from this end, but we're not getting Ann's video, so maybe Ann.
Hi, I'm not doing a video. I'm volunteering right now too, so I'm just going to listen in.
Perfect.
Okay.
Yeah, welcome, Ann. Go ahead, Dick.
Glad you can make it, Ann.
Well,
thank you.
I come from the Lanyon Church, in the same one that Johanna and so did my brother John. So, but Backstrom was a pastor there from around 1931 to 1939. So he knew all of Johanna's children, yes. And that's how I'm related to him. That has something to do with, that's why he knew the story, I think.
Yeah, and isn't that where Fred Berg was from, Lanyon?
Yes.
The Berg family?
Yeah, Fred Berg's farm was a mile away from our farms.
Great.
Thanks, Laura. Looks like
I have a question. I mean, that was interesting about the I think you used the word longing. So was that a theme that's been written about that, you know, today, I don't know, we have a word melancholy, I guess, we use for whatever the troubles are today and whatever. But at that time, then there was sort of, with their theme of loneliness and isolation and things like that, that the church addressed. Would that be I mean, would that have been one of the driving forces for people starting churches, going long distance in church and so on?
Oh, I think definitely. I think there's, you know, layers to longing, and the longing is very human, whether it be spiritual longing, whatever is going on, you know, inside your life and your heart and your head. But it's something that really resonated with immigrants or any migrant people or anyone that's on a physical or spiritual pilgrimage. So the immigrants often knew isolation and loneliness, a kind of homesickness, and you know, a younger person especially sees their whole future lying ahead of them, and that brings both excitement and anxiety. I think a kind of a key place to look in this particular tradition at themes of longing and pilgrimage and all that is in the hymns and spiritual songs that they wrote. It's very rich in that area that combines both elements of separation from everything that was familiar, from home. A lot of younger people left and never saw their parents again. About 1 in 6 immigrants did return. They went home, so to speak. Some went back and forth a few times or even several times. But that deep longing went both ways, both those who left and those who were left behind. And those bonds, you know, for I don't want to use the word typical, but the Covenant Church was not only made up of younger people, but they tended to come from rural agrarian areas, farming communities that had been on the same place for generations. And as industrialization came, and because of lots of reasons why fewer children were dying, families got large, the farm went to the oldest son, and there were a lot of young men and women who felt displaced. And they thought it was less of a dislocation to emigrate and find themselves among people who, what held them together was language and common experience. They might have come from the same provinces, et cetera, than it was to move to a city in Sweden and try to find work or that kind of thing. It was very liberating. So that theme of longing, you might know that the Norwegian great immigrant author Ole Rovag, Giants in the Earth. One of his books was called The Boat of Longing. And he works with that theme, well, as he does in Giants in the Earth, as did Wilhelm Moberg in his Immigrant trilogy. And the longing was often felt most deeply by women. That's what comes through in these novels.
Thank you.
Yep.
So I'd really like to explore a little bit more about Carl August Bjork. That could be a subject for a lot more than 1 hour, I think, and you have enthusiasm to talk about that. But I have kind of a side question that I'm reluctant to ask, but it's been confusing to me because I read at one point that he lost his family, his young family, at an early age. But then in the ancestry that I've looked at, that he's buried in Chicago, in Cook County.
Rose
But it
Hill
references
Cemetery.
the whole family. So can you shed light on that?
That's something I have never heard.
Okay, I think this was wrong. Somebody got that wrong. So
Yeah. I don't know if he emigrated with others. I don't think, and whether he was married or not when they went, I'm just not sure. But at that early date, and by early I mean anything before 1870, when you could sail by steam, and a month-long voyage turned into 6 days. But prior to that time, the voyages were long, and there were cholera epidemics especially. And a lot of children and family members died at sea, or they died when they arrived here. There is that story about Gustav Eunomius and others who came to Chicago in the early 1850s, where they lost their whole families. Lars Paul Esbjörn, one of the early Augustana founders, who did go back to Sweden when he was in Andover, Illinois, and built a chapel there that was funded by Jenny Lind. He lost his entire family to cholera. So I've never heard that associated with Bjork.
I'll get you the citation and we'll maybe talk
yeah, I'd like to see that
on that one. So just to summarize on Bjork, for one point, Carl Olson cites in his book that Bjork's career as a preacher of the word had begun on Good Friday, 1867.
Yeah, 67. And that would be the story of having to preach. And then the congregation is formed in 1868 and a mission house built. Before that, they would have been meeting in homes, conventicles.
I'm kind of curious about the transition from Swedish to English and the process. You brought up the hymnals, the hymns.
Mm-hmm.
Were those initially written in Swedish and then translated for congregations into English, or were they written, some of them at least, written originally in English?
Yeah, it's both. The first covenant hymnal in English doesn't appear until I think it's 1921. Everything before that is in Swedish, and they began emerging in the 1870s. And what they were, especially in the renewal tradition that the covenant came out of, because it was linked in a wide variety of ways we could talk about to Anglo-American renewal experiences. There's both hymns and songs, Lina Sandell, Oscar Anfeld, all those people who wrote in Swedish and produced their own tunes, and they were popular in the conventicles and then in the missionary societies and came into the church. But simultaneous to that, beginning as early as the 1860s, they were aware of music being written, especially in the United States, by, I guess we would call gospel hymn writers, whether it's Fanny Crosby or P.P. Bliss or whatever it may be. And there was a guy in Sweden, there were others too, but someone who was very well known, Eric Nyström, who was a scholar of language and literature at Uppsala. He began to translate these English language hymns and songs into Swedish. So they became well known and just as popular. And someone like Lina Sandell, she wrote 600, well, she wrote poems that turned into hymns. There were 600 of them. I mean, this is amazing. And these were people who were literate. They were highly literate, even if they may have had what we would equate a 3rd or 5th grade education. They read, and reading and singing propelled the renewal movement along with the preaching.
Well, thank you. Actually, I think this could open up a whole topic. I know Laura is steeped in music, and the whole interface between gospel music and folk music, I think that could keep us going for a long time. But Steve, you probably have other questions you want to get to.
Yeah, and I just double checked something. I think in my reading, I missed, I should have said 51 for Obed Simon, not 57, because I was looking at Tim Anderson, Tim Johnson, I mean, had sent me your information, and he had given me 3 books. And one of them was this Sing It Again, a handbook on the hymnal. And this is related to your question, Bruce, because our great uncle had translated from Swedish days. You're familiar with that. My soul now magnifies the Lord.
Yep.
In that. The second question has to do with the Free Church, and I'm going to give the eldest of the grandkids here the credit for getting us started down this path. Dick, I even made a notation. I received this on September 14th, 2021. He opened my eyes and others to Carl Olson's work, and so he had sent around some pages. And what kind of started this discussion, if I remember right, Dick, correct me if I'm wrong, but the reference to the 1885 follow-up from the Boone meeting and the distinguishing of the Free Church, the Covenant Church, and the not clearly identified 5 people. And so we've had discussions about the difference between the Covenant Church and the Free Church. And I maybe oversimplified this, but from my readings, it seems like there was a difference of opinion about the formal training of preachers, ministers. Am I off base on that?
I didn't think it was that. I thought it was a dispute about how independent the church could be from the denomination, and the Free Church wanted the churches to be more independent and not submit to the denomination. The Covenant was the other way around to some extent. I think Bjork was somewhat behind that. That's my interpretation of it. We had one pastor in Wisconsin here who said it worked out to be opposite what they wanted to, but I haven't studied that much.
Phil?
Okay.
Yeah, well, education's part of it, but only part of it. I think it's helpful to see that the renewal movement began to unfold in the United States in ways that could be very different from what they had experienced in Sweden. Though there was kind of a reverse effect in the 1890s of these American influences, Anglo-American influences finding their way back to Sweden especially. So it's evolving, and after these congregations began to form in 1868, and then many, many more in the early 1870s, late 1870s, there's an identity question of who these people who referred to themselves as mission friends. And they did so because of their prior experience in the renewal movements within the Church of Sweden. They were tied to the Church of Sweden, but they were uncomfortable because of the pressure they felt. There were laws against meeting in small groups known as conventicles and homes and all of that. In the United States, they experienced a freedom and liberation from those kinds of constraints that were changing in Sweden. But you have to remember, Sweden was really slow. They had their first act of religious toleration in 1858. In England, it was in 1680. That's a huge difference. So the freedom was quite exhilarating. But the other thing they discovered was American religion is both pluralistic and competitive. And that's denominations, sectarian groups, and so on. So they began to debate, as Richard said, the role of denominations. By the early 1870s, these mission friends figured that they needed to find a formal way to assert their identity because of their discomfort with the Augustana Synod, which was the only great synod of Swedish American churches. And that was formed in 1860. So that already had a bit of life and they had decisions to make. So in the early 1870s, they started their own synods. And they ended up competing with each other. One was the Mission Synod and one was the Ansgar Synod. And here you find where education shows up really early. The Ansgar Synod immediately began a school in Knoxville, Illinois.
Mm-hmm.
The Mission Synod wasn't so sure. They thought that the Bible and some Bible training could be sufficient to be a good preacher evangelist. And they weren't sure they wanted to spend the money to start a school. The Mission Synod at a meeting, it might have been in Des Moines, Iowa, in the late 1870s, actually passed a resolution stating that they don't believe in seminaries or whatever they are called. The disciples learned at the feet of Jesus, that should be enough. Well, you can see the debate is going back and forth about education, and the majority of those who become covenant are deeply committed to a school, and that becomes North Park. Without minimizing that in many covenant churches, there was a resistance to education or the kind of education they thought was being taught, and especially to these preachers. Now, where the Free Church comes in is that in the late 1870s, around 1878, there's an aspect of the renewal movement that becomes very strong among the mission friends, that within 2 or 3 years, it's divided them into kind of a left wing and a right wing, and the right wing being the free. They started their own newspapers that would be in competition with the other papers, and there's one based in Chicago, and that became a mouthpiece for the ideas that, even more important to education, had to do with the Bible and theology. The most significant influence among the free at this period of time and on into the 20th century, and it shows, I think, the shaping of the Free Church today, was a theology known as dispensationalism. And that came from John Nelson Darby, who was Irish and had his own quarrels in the 1840s with the Church of England, and he started a new religious group called the Plymouth Brethren. So you might identify theologies like dispensationalism with the Plymouth Brethren, but it also worked its way into any number of fundamentalist groups. And so if you look at schools today or seminaries, there are some that stand out as being distinctly dispensational, like Dallas Seminary in Texas. Or Wheaton went through a phase of this as well, and found its way into conservative American evangelicalism. And within dispensationalism, I think there were 3 kind of points they really latched onto. One was a very literal reading of Scripture that did not come from the Lutheran and Lutheran Pietist tradition and the way they read the Bible. For the free, you had to have absolute certainty. There was a right way, there was a wrong way, etc. The second thing was that they were anti-denominational. And if you read the language that they used at the time, and I think the best kind of treatment of this in the primary sources is Carl Olson's book, Into One Body by the Cross, Volume 1, which came out in 1985, part of a 2-volume centennial anniversary history. And the rhetoric was very strong. Denominations are of the devil. they're evil, you should have nothing to do with them. And the logic even got pushed to the point where the whole earthly church is in ruins. The only true church is spiritual. And then you wait for the rapture. And that's the third point, is what they did with eschatology or the doctrine of last times. Most early Covenanters were not what now we would call premillenarian secret rapture dispensationalists. That found its way into the covenant tradition through the Anglo-American influences of not only the Plymouth Brethren, but the popular American revival preachers of the day. Dwight L. Moody was kind of a soft version of this, but others they hammered home. And the way they did it, where like in Swede Bend and other places, you would have mission societies and mission meetings. The Free, almost immediately after 1878, turned these into the American Prophecy Conferences. So instead of going to a mission meeting to gather with people and friends and family and strangers and experience hospitality and preaching on a wide range of topics, and then they'd sit around and talk about it. Lay people and the early, I guess we can use the word clergy, they had to figure out how they would ordain and educate and all that themselves. Well, the Free was basically against all of that at the time. So if you went to a prophecy conference, it was more than gospel preaching leading towards change of heart or conversion. It was talking about the end of the world and being able to read the signs of the times, et cetera, et cetera. And this became very intense throughout the end of the 19th century and into the beginning of the 20th century. It divided families, the level of anger and vitriol was very, very high. And this was occurring among people who knew each other and oftentimes knew each other well. A parallel, I mean, it's just a very general parallel, how something like politics in America today can divide families. Who you're willing to sit down and eat Thanksgiving dinner with. This is equivalent to that because these were small communities. And because of the competitive nature of Swedish American religion, in those communities, you had more than one church. You probably had the Augustana Church, the Mission Church, the Baptist Church, the Free Church. And the larger the area, I mean, I grew up in First Covenant, Minneapolis, like some of you had your origins. At the turn of the century, you could walk from 7th and Chicago, the corner on where First Covenant stands, and walk east. And within a 5-block area, you would have encountered every single Swedish American denomination with their church on their corner. And if you moved in the direction, well, a lot of them proselytized. So that was the nature of it. And so the Free emergence and then the differences that occurred with the mission, within the Mission Friends, and then the Free Church would say, we organized in 1884 in Boone, Iowa. That was a prophecy conference and delegates came, but they didn't, where did they come from? They came as individuals. Nobody sent them. They didn't represent churches or congregations. So what did they decide in Boone, Iowa? They decided not to organize. They didn't organize anything. If you want to look at the origins of the Free Church as a denomination and a formal organization, then you look at something like 1908. It took that long for it to happen. Where when the Covenant, the following year in February, had a meeting in Chicago to decide about forming a church, congregations sent delegates. And delegates represented in democratic ways the people that they were representing. And so I think the clearest way to distinguish the free from the covenant in those early days was free church. The character of the free church is atomistic. It's a collection of individuals. The covenant church was organic. It's the interdependency of congregations who are members. And if you were a member of the covenant church denomination, it's because you were a member of a local congregation. So you get all these layers. So it's really complicated, but Carl Olson's good at giving us the language to talk about it and then understanding it.
Thank you. That's
a
very
long
helpful.
answer. Sorry.
Well, that's a good answer. And any follow-up from? If not, we'll move on to this question about Galesburg. And yeah. I think we'll probably, I think we'll skip over that. Dave, you brought our attention, one of our relatives, Frank Johnson. And we've been trying to track that down through a minister there. We have a letter that we've got in draft form that we're thinking about all signing and sending it. But, well, I think...
The only thing that I did not, and you brought it up too, that there's an Emmanuel Lutheran Church and then the First Lutheran Church of Galesburg. And what I understand from, doing research, which I don't know if I can verify or not exactly, but there was an obituary on Frank August Johnson, J.P. Johnson's brother, that stayed in Galesburg, and we're trying to figure out if he may have been a member of one of those churches and to find a little bit more about him. That's the only thing that I was really initially interested in doing, because he died in Lanyon and was buried back in the Linwood Cemetery in Galesburg.
Yeah.
If I got it right, he was the brother of J.P. Johnson, and then one other sister, is it Helen? Ended up in Lundin. She was a Burman, became and she lives in the area too. So, and all of our relatives, said, it all started back in Altona, Illinois. And that's where J.P. Johnson, from what I understand, and Joanna Dorothea were married in 1869, if I got that right. I don't know if anybody can verify that or not. And they had 3 children in Altona, and they all ended up in Lanyon. And that's kind of where we were at in terms of Altona.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm not sure about the 1869 date. We'd have to double check that one, because that. Yeah. Go ahead, Phil.
Just one point that probably germane is the Emmanuel Lutheran Church in Galesburg was an Augustana congregation, and early congregations after 1868 that would become covenant, at least in those days, they often were uncomfortable in an Augustana congregation, so they'd start something new. And that's what happened in Galesburg through the influence of a Danish Lutheran pastor, Charles Anderson, who had been a chaplain in the American Civil War with the Union. He was the founder of the Ansgar Synod. So the congregation that formed in Galesburg in 1868 called itself the First Lutheran Church of Galesburg. And then after the covenant was formed, at some point, now it's known as Galesburg Covenant, but that's the same, what was First Lutheran originally.
Okay. Oh, good. That helps. Well, we've only, hard to believe that it's almost 5 o'clock. But I do want to touch on the question of pietism and a better understanding, because we have discussed this, we've looked at different definitions. We, at least I have tried to understand the pious, the publication pious, and the derivation, and whether it's related. But that's a clumsy way to get to the question of, has the use of the word pietism or pious, is that evolved over time in the Covenant Church?
Well, we may need to Zoom again, and I'm
Okay.
very,
Sounds
very
good to
happy
us.
to, very happy to. I mean, this is a big topic, and I think historians are not clear on a single definition of pietism. I think one of the first things to say about it is that it's a renewal movement that emerged at the end of the 17th century in Germany and other places, and then took its own forms in England, like the Wesleys who started the Methodist Church. You have to talk about pietism.
Well,
And these renewal movements that began within established state churches had an effect on everything. It's kind of an injustice to call it an ism, because then you think it's something you can define. I prefer the adjective or the noun. You were a pietist, something like that. And virtually every Protestant denomination is influenced by pietism in one way or another. And our tradition was influenced most by Lutheran pietism, and the way that it found its way into Sweden, and especially through a branch of German pietists, the Moravians, Zinzendorf and others. So, but the Jewish tradition had a pietist form, Hasidic Jews. Roman Catholics had their own, Jansenists. So it's kind of out there, and it's wherever there are attempts to get the head down into the heart and link it to ethics. And Paul Homer, the late Paul Homer, who grew up in Salem Covenant in Minneapolis and was, a well-known philosopher, theologian at Minnesota, and then most of his career at Yale. I once asked Paul, how would you define pietism? And he said, oh, that's easy. It's the behavior of Christian belief. So then historically, you flesh that out by talking about particular people and leaders and what their theologies were like. So in the Covenant Church, the pietistic identity is directly linked to the renewal movement in Sweden that came principally from German pietists like Spener and Franke and the Moravians, because the Moravian tradition was especially heartfelt and almost mystical. Carl Olson writes about, and you can again see this in the hymnody, there's almost a mystical quality, if you think of the mystic tradition in the whole Christian church, of that kind of expression. There are many different kinds of mystics, and I wouldn't call Covenanters mystics, but it could find their way into their language. And especially, I think, in the Moravian language and the kinds of hymns that they wrote. So this was a kind of a founding anchor point. And that magazine in Sweden, Pietisten, that lasted until World War I in Sweden, that's the name was revived, 25 years ago by the guys in Minneapolis that started what I think is a very interesting publication, and it now comes out of Seattle with a younger generation. The Covenant, one of the distinctions that complicates this is that, it's a big topic, but within the Covenant Church, there was a more churchly tradition and a more low church evangelical tradition. Growing up in First Covenant Minneapolis, that was the Church of Skooksburg and Gustav Johnson. I mean, that's low church. It was what I'd call a dignified informality with, there's not much liturgy there. Where my wife grew up in First Covenant St. Paul, that was the churchly tradition. And if you've ever been in those two sanctuaries, the old tabernacle or what's in St. Paul, the liturgy, the nature of the preaching, the worship, you understand the differences. And in my own story, I'm very appreciative of First Covenant Minneapolis, but I remained a Covenanter because of First Covenant St. Paul. as someone growing up, you know, and maturing in the late 60s as a college student at the University of Minnesota. There were those differences, and you would find the clearer articulation of the pietist tradition going forward, how it affects how you read the Bible, how you do theology, how you think about life together, and all of those things on the more churchly side. I think in recent years, maybe the last 20 years, as the Covenant Church has grown so rapidly and changed in so many ways, to talk about being a pietist took on a very positive influence, getting beyond the old stereotypes of, well, it just means you're overly pious or so heavenly minded, you're no earthly good or whatever, as a way to try to define a core of a church that's changing so rapidly. But the changes are very real. I mean, they are very real. And the previous president of the Covenant Church, he was only in for 4 years and he's now gone. He said a couple of years ago that he thought the real problem in the Covenant was those people who talk about being pietists. So how do you have a conversation? You have a conversation because you read sources, you know history, and you can think theologically. So it's a fascinating question, both of definition and how it's reflected in any number of church bodies. But then how does it function within one church body? I was at a conference in the 1980s with the Study for American Evangelicals at Wheaton College, just a wonderful institute there. And the leader at that time of the group, Joel Carpenter, who then went on to be provost at Calvin College, when historians were beginning to write about imagined history, and anyone who writes history is employing imagination in some form. But Joel said to me, Phil, how do you know that the Covenant didn't just make up all this stuff about being pietist? And I said, well, you got to read the sources. And Joel certainly knows how to read the sources. He's a tremendous historian, but he never worked in this particular area and worked on aspects of American evangelicalism that tended to misunderstand pietism and fragment it as anti-intellectual. So that gets us into the weeds. I'm sorry for that, but
no apology.
It's such a fascinating topic.
Yeah, and I'm going to close this by calling you professor, but friend and Phil.
Yeah.
And I hope we can take you up on your offer to come back and do this again. And Bruce, at this point, I was going to mention one thing at the beginning. If you had questions, use the chat. I didn't, but if you've got some follow-up questions, if you wanted to send them to Bruce. And Bruce, do you want to close the session?
Well, I will, Stephen. Thank you for moderating, and Phil, thank you for just a really stimulating discussion. And as I mentioned earlier, and I want to reiterate, I think as we think about what we've experienced this afternoon, I know that there are going to be many, many other questions that will come up and threads or tentacles from this conversation that we can take in new directions. And I hope we'll be able to look to you, Phil, for direct and indirect resources that may help us with some of these questions that come up. So again, thanks to you and Steve, and thanks everybody for participating this afternoon. My sense is that we have managed to kind of break some new ground with our video Zooms. So we'll look forward to a continuing conversation.
Yeah, well, and let me thank you for inviting me into your homes and into your family. And I'm available anytime. I love doing this kind of thing, and being retired, though busy, I have lots of time.
Yeah.
Sitting up here on Lake Superior on a beautiful 60-degree day.